Dominic Valenti hadn't built his empire by showing weakness. In 30 years of running the most powerful crime family on the eastern seaboard, he'd learned that sentiment was a bullet waiting to be fired at your back. His name alone could empty a restaurant, silence a courtroom, make men who had faced death without flinching suddenly remember urgent appointments elsewhere. The Valenti mansion sat like a fortress on 12 acres of manicured grounds, hidden behind iron gates and surveillance systems that would make federal agencies jealous. Marble floors polished to perfection. Crystal chandeliers that had witnessed more secrets than most people could imagine in a lifetime. Staff who understood that seeing nothing and saying less was the only path to continued employment. His empire stretched across legitimate businesses that served as elegant masks for darker operations. Restaurants where certain conversations happened in back rooms. Construction companies that occasionally poured foundations a little deeper than blueprints specified. Real estate holdings that laundered money so clean it sparkled. Dominic controlled it all with the precision of a surgeon and the mercy of a winter storm. His men would die for him. They also feared him, which was exactly how he preferred it. Loyalty bought through respect lasted longer than loyalty bought through love. Love made people stupid. Love made them take risks. Love got them killed. He'd learned that lesson the hard way. 15 years ago, Dominic Valenti had been a different man. He'd had a wife named Catherine, a woman whose laugh could make him forget the blood on his hands. She'd been pregnant with their first child, a daughter they'd already named Isabella. The nursery in the East Wing had been painted soft yellow. The crib assembled, the tiny clothes folded and waiting. Catherine died in childbirth. The baby died with her. Something inside Dominic had died that night too. He'd buried his wife, buried his daughter, and buried every soft thing left in his soul. The nursery door had been locked for 15 years. His men knew never to mention it. The women who occasionally shared his bed knew better than to ask about the room that was always closed. He had become untouchable, unfeeling, unbreakable, or so he'd thought. Now, standing in the November cold with his breath forming clouds in the darkness, Dominic stared down at a child who had just asked him a question that cut through 30 years of armor like it was tissue paper. Please don't tell my mama. She'll lose her job. Recognition hit him like a physical blow. This wasn't some random street child who had wandered onto his property. He knew this face. He'd seen it before, briefly, fleetingly, during school holidays when his maid brought her daughter to work because childcare cost more than she could afford. Rosa Martinez, the quiet woman who arrived before dawn and left after sunset, who cleaned the blood off his floors without asking questions, who prepared meals for his men without flinching when they discussed business that would make normal people sick. Rosa had worked for him for 3 years. She was reliable, invisible, perfect. She never complained, never asked for more hours, never said a word about her life outside these walls. Now Dominic understood why. This was Rosa's daughter, Sophia, 7 years old, and she was sleeping behind his dumpster. Dominic crouched down slowly, making himself smaller, less threatening. The girl pressed herself back against the brick wall, clutching that thin blanket like it could protect her from whatever came next. Up close, he could see what the headlights had hidden, the holes in her shoes, the way her second-hand clothes hung loose on a frame that was too thin, the dark circles under her eyes that spoke of too many sleepless nights. How long have you been doing this, Sophia? His voice came out gentler than he'd intended, gentler than his men had ever heard it. Sophia's bottom lip trembled. Her brown eyes darted toward the dumpster, toward the mansion, anywhere but his face. She was calculating, he realized, trying to figure out how much trouble she was in, trying to protect her mother even now. Brave kid. I asked you a question. Dominic kept his voice soft but firm, the same tone he used when he needed truth from people who were afraid to give it. I need you to tell me. How long have you been sleeping here? The silence stretched between them. Then, in a voice so small it nearly broke him, Sophia answered, Since the summer. 4 months. This child had been sleeping behind his dumpster for 4 months, and he hadn't known. His security team hadn't flagged it. His staff hadn't mentioned it. She'd made herself invisible, just like her mother had taught her. Dominic's hands clenched into fists at his sides, not from anger at the child, from something else entirely, something that felt dangerously close to the emotions he'd spent 15 years burying. Where does your mama think you are right now? In the car. Sophia's voice cracked. She works late. I'm supposed to stay in the car until she's done. But it gets so cold. And I found the warm spot by the big metal box. And I only meant to get warm for a little bit. But sometimes I fall asleep and... She was crying now. Tears streaming down hollow cheeks that should have been round with childhood. Her small body shaking with sobs she was trying desperately to contain. Please don't fire my mama. She didn't know. I didn't tell her. She thinks I stay in the car. She'll be so mad at me. Please, Mr. Valenti, please don't tell her. We need this job. We need it so bad. The words hit Dominic like bullets, each one finding a gap in armor he'd thought was impenetrable. Rosa had been hiding this. Her daughter had been hiding this. They'd been surviving in the shadows of his empire, and he'd been too focused on territory and profit to notice that a child was starving under his own roof. For the first time in 15 years, Dominic felt something crack open in his chest. Something that had been locked away since the night he'd buried Catherine and Isabella. He reached out slowly, carefully, the way you'd approach a wounded animal, and placed his hand on Sophia's thin shoulder. She flinched at the touch, but didn't pull away. Nobody is firing anybody tonight. His voice was rough, unfamiliar even to his own ears. And I need you to do something for me, Sophia. I need you to come inside where it's warm. Can you do that? She looked up at him with those huge brown eyes, hope and terror warring across her young features. Inside? Your house? My house. Where there's food and heat and blankets that aren't falling apart. Sophia clutched her torn blanket tighter, as if afraid he might take it from her. But what about Mama? She doesn't know I'm here. She'll worry. I'm going to call your mama right now. I'm going to tell her you're safe. And then we're going to figure out what's happening, because something tells me there's more to this story than a little girl who got cold in a car. Sophia went very still, the kind of stillness that told Dominic everything he needed to know. There was more, much more, and whatever it was worse than a child sleeping behind a dumpster. Marcus, Dominic called over his shoulder. His bodyguard snapped to attention instantly. Get Maria. Tell her to prepare the blue guest room. Hot food, warm bath, clean clothes. Now. Boss? Marcus hesitated, clearly confused by the situation. Is everything... Now, Marcus. The steel in Dominic's voice sent Marcus running toward the mansion. Within seconds, lights were flickering on throughout the house. Staff members, roused from sleep, began moving with the efficient urgency that came from years of serving a man who didn't ask twice. Dominic turned back to Sophia. She was watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Fear, yes, but something else, too. Something that looked almost like hope. "Can you walk?" She nodded, struggling to her feet. The blanket fell away, and Dominic saw what she'd been clutching against her chest all this time. A photograph, worn and creased from being handled too many times. Two faces smiled up at him from the image. A younger Sophia, maybe 4 or 5, sitting on the lap of a woman whose exhausted eyes still managed to shine with love. Rosa Martinez and her daughter, captured in a moment of happiness that felt like it belonged to a different lifetime. Sophia caught him looking and quickly tucked the photo back against her chest. "Mama says we have to remember the good times, even when things get hard." Dominic's throat tightened. His hands, which had signed death warrants without trembling, shook as he reached down and lifted Sophia into his arms. She weighed almost nothing, like a bird, like something the wind could carry away. "Come on," he said quietly. "Let's get you inside." As he carried her toward the mansion, Sophia's small arms wrapped around his neck. She smelled like exhaust fumes and garbage and something underneath that was simply child, simply innocent. Simply everything Dominic had convinced himself he didn't need. "Mr. Valenti?" Her voice was barely a whisper against his collar. "Yes? Are you going to help my mama?" The question hit him harder than any blow he'd ever taken. Here was this child, hungry and cold and scared, and her first thought was still about protecting her mother. "I'm going to try," Dominic heard himself say. "I'm going to try." He didn't make promises he couldn't keep. That was one of his rules. But as he carried Sophia Martinez through the doors of his mansion, past the stunned faces of his staff and the confused looks of his guards, Dominic felt something shifting inside him. Something that had been dead for 15 years was starting to breathe again. Maria, his head housekeeper, met them in the foyer. The older woman's hand flew to her mouth when she saw Sophia. Tears sprang to her eyes instantly, the way they did when anyone with a heart saw a child who'd been through too much. "Dios mío," her voice cracked. "The little one. Rosa's girl. What has happened?" "That's what we're going to find out." Dominic's voice carried the quiet authority that made people move. "Get her warm. Get her fed. And call Rosa. Tell her to come to the main house immediately. Tell her Sophia is safe, but we need to talk." Maria nodded, already reaching for Sophia with gentle hands. But the girl clung to Dominic's neck, suddenly afraid to let go of the first person who had shown her kindness in months. "It's okay." Dominic's voice softened in a way that made Maria's eyes widen. "Maria is going to take care of you while I talk to your mama. She's going to give you hot chocolate and cookies and a warm bed. Would you like that?" Sophia hesitated. Then slowly she loosened her grip. "But you'll come back? You'll tell Mama I didn't mean to cause trouble?" "You didn't cause any trouble, sweetheart." Dominic set her down gently, crouching to meet her eyes. "None of this is your fault. Do you understand me?" "None of it." Sophia nodded, though her eyes said she didn't quite believe him. She'd been told too many times that everything was her fault, that she was a burden, that she needed to be smaller, quieter, more invisible. Dominic recognized the look. He'd seen it in the eyes of people who had been broken by those who were supposed to love them. Maria led Sophia away toward the kitchen, murmuring soft words in Spanish. Dominic watched them go, his mind already racing through possibilities, each one worse than the last. A woman working 16-hour days while her daughter slept in a car. A child who'd learned to find warm spots near exhaust vents. A family so desperate they couldn't ask for help. Boss. Marcus appeared at his elbow, voice low. Rosa Martinez just arrived. She was sleeping in her car, in the back lot, near the service entrance. Dominic closed his eyes. Course she was. The pieces were falling into place now, forming a picture that made his blood run cold and hot at the same time. Rosa wasn't just hiding her daughter's situation. She was hiding her own. Bring her to my study. And Marcus? Dominic's voice dropped to something dangerous. No one else hears about this tonight. Not until I understand what we're dealing with. Marcus nodded and disappeared. Dominic stood alone in the foyer of his mansion, surrounded by wealth that suddenly felt obscene. Crystal chandeliers and marble floors and priceless artwork, and 20 feet away, a woman had been sleeping in her car while her daughter foraged for warm spots like a stray animal. 30 years of building an empire, and he'd missed the suffering happening right under his nose. That was about to change. Rosa Martinez entered his study like a woman walking to her execution. Her shoulders were rigid, her face pale, her hands clasped so tightly in front of her that her knuckles had gone white. She wore the same clothes she'd been wearing when she left work 6 hours ago. The same clothes, Dominic now realized. She probably wore every day because she couldn't afford anything else. Mr. Valenti. Her voice was steady, but he could hear the tremor beneath it. I'm so sorry. I can explain. Sophia was supposed to stay in the car. I told her never to leave the car. I'll make sure it doesn't happen again. I'll find somewhere else for her to... Sit down, Rosa. The words stopped her mid-sentence. In 3 years, he'd spoken directly to her maybe a dozen times. Bosses like Dominic Valenti didn't make conversation with the help. Sir, please. Her composure cracked, just a little. If I've done something wrong, if there's a problem with my work, I'll fix it. I'll do better. Rosa, sit down. She lowered herself into the leather chair across from his desk. Her whole body was trembling now, and she couldn't hide it anymore. Dominic watched as years of careful control started to crumble. He pulled out his own chair and sat across from her. Not behind his desk, where the furniture would create a barrier of authority. Across from her, like an equal, like someone who wanted to understand. Tell me about your daughter. Rosa's eyes went wide with fresh terror. Sophia, she's never been any trouble, sir. I swear it. She knows the rules. She stays quiet, does her homework, never bothers anyone. I make sure she's invisible. She knows how important it is to be Rosa. Dominic held up his hand. I need you to stop. Take a breath. And then I need you to tell me the truth about what's been happening. All of it. The silence stretched between them. Rosa's face crumpled, rebuilt itself, crumpled again. She was fighting a war inside herself, and Dominic could see the exact moment she lost. Tears spilled down her cheeks. Not the quiet tears of someone used to crying, the messy, broken tears of someone who had been holding everything together for so long that falling apart felt like drowning. How long have you been homeless, Rosa? The question hung in the air like a death sentence. Rosa's mouth opened, closed, her hands twisted in her lap. 4 months. Her voice was barely audible. The landlord raised the rent. I tried to make it work. I picked up extra shifts. I sold everything we had that was worth anything. But it wasn't enough. It was never enough. So you've been living in your car. Rosa nodded, shame radiating from every inch of her. We were in a shelter for a while, but then we had to leave, and the car was all we had left. Dominic leaned forward. Why did you have to leave the shelter? Rosa's face went white, then red, then white again. Something flickered in her eyes. Fear, but not fear of him. Fear of something else entirely. Rosa, who are you running from? The question broke her completely. She bent forward, face in her hands, sobbing with the kind of grief that comes from carrying impossible weight for too long. His name is Marco. Her voice came out muffled, broken. My ex-husband. We divorced 2 years ago. After years of... Sophia's voice cut through her mother's sobs from the doorway. The bad man. Dominic turned. Sophia stood in the hallway, Maria hovering helplessly behind her. The little girl was wrapped in a blanket that probably cost more than everything she owned combined. Her eyes were fixed on her mother. The bad man found us at the shelter. Sophia's voice was matter-of-fact in the way children's voices get when they've seen too much. He grabbed Mama. He said we belong to him. He said he'll always find us. Rosa lifted her head, horror replacing grief. Mija, you weren't supposed to hear? He pushed me down the stairs once, Sophia continued, as if her mother hadn't spoken. When I was little. That's why my leg hurts sometimes. Dominic felt something cold settle in his chest. The kind of cold that came before violence. The kind of cold he hadn't felt in years. He looked at Sophia, really looked, and for the first time, he noticed the slight limp she tried to hide, the way she favored her left leg, the old injury that had never been properly treated. His vision went red at the edges. Rosa, look at me. She raised her tear-stained face to his, this man, this Marco. Is he the reason you can't stay anywhere? The reason you can't ask for help? If I ask for help, there are records. Her voice was hollow. Records he can trace. Every time I try to rebuild, every time I think we're safe, he finds us. He has friends. He knows people. He always finds us. She pulled her sleeve up, revealing a bruise on her wrist. 3 days old, by the look of it. The unmistakable pattern of fingers that had gripped too hard. He was outside the shelter last week, just watching, reminding me that he can get to us whenever he wants. Dominic stood slowly. His movements were controlled, deliberate. The same movements he made before delivering verdicts that couldn't be appealed. Maria, take Sophia back to the kitchen. Make sure she eats something warm. Mr. Valenti, Rosa started. You and Sophia are staying here tonight. Both of you. In this house where my security team can actually do their job. We can't accept... Rosa's pride flared, even through her exhaustion. We're not charity cases. I work for what we have. I just need more time. I just need... This isn't charity. Dominic's voice cut through her protests. This is an employer providing emergency housing for a valued member of his staff. If that doesn't work for you, then consider it a loan. You can pay me back when you're stable. Rosa stared at him, her mouth opening and closing. She didn't know how to respond to kindness. It had been so long since anyone had offered it. Why? She finally whispered. Why would you do this for us? Dominic didn't answer immediately. He walked to the window and looked out at the darkness beyond the glass. Somewhere out there, a man named Marco was hunting a woman and child, like they were prey. 15 years ago, Dominic said quietly, I lost my wife and daughter. They died in the same moment, and I couldn't save them. I had all the power in the world, and I couldn't protect the only people who mattered. He turned back to face Rosa. Tonight I found a little girl sleeping behind my dumpster. A little girl whose mother has been fighting alone for years. And I decided that this time, I'm not going to stand by and watch someone suffer when I have the power to help. Rosa's tears started fresh. Get some sleep, Rosa. Tomorrow we're going to figure out how to make sure Marco Delgado never threatens your family again." He was almost to the door when Rosa's voice stopped him. "Mr. Valenti?" He paused but didn't turn. "Thank you for seeing us." Dominic walked out without responding, because if he'd tried to speak, his voice would have broken. And Dominic Valenti's voice didn't break. Not for anyone. Not until tonight. The next morning arrived cold and gray, with clouds threatening snow that wouldn't quite fall. Dominic hadn't slept. He'd spent the hours before dawn making calls, pulling strings, and building a wall of protection around two people who didn't even know they needed it. Dr. Patricia Chen arrived at 7. Sophia was examined thoroughly, diagnosed with bronchial infection and malnutrition, prescribed antibiotics and a dietary plan that made Rosa cry again when she saw it. Fresh fruits and vegetables, protein, vitamins, things Sophia hadn't had regularly in months. The lawyer came at 9. Emergency custody paperwork that would make it impossible for Marco to claim any legal right to his daughter. A restraining order that would be filed before noon. By 10 o'clock, Dominic's most trusted lieutenant had a team watching Marco Delgado's every move. The man was still in the city, still circling, still hunting. He wouldn't be hunting much longer. It was almost noon when Dominic's phone rang. "Boss." Marcus's voice was tight. "There's a man at the gate. Says his name is Marco Delgado. Says he knows his wife and kid are here. Says he's not leaving until he sees them." Dominic felt that cold settle into his bones again. The cold that came before consequences. Keep him at the gate. "I'm on my way." The walk from his study to the front entrance took less than 2 minutes. But in those 2 minutes, Dominic Valenti transformed from the man who had carried a sleeping child in his arms to the man who had built an empire on fear. His men fell into step behind him. They didn't know the details, but they recognized the walk. They'd seen it before, usually right before someone learned a very hard lesson about crossing the wrong family. Marco Delgado stood at the iron gates, flanked by two friends who looked like they'd seen the inside of a few gyms and the outside of even more bars. They were trying to look tough. They had no idea what tough looked like. Marco was average height, muscular, with the kind of swagger that came from beating people who couldn't fight back. His smile was predatory. His eyes were mean. He was exactly the type of man Dominic had spent 30 years learning to destroy. Dominic approached the gate slowly. His men spread out behind him, hands resting casually on weapons that were anything but casual. Marco's smile flickered when he saw the entourage, but he was too stupid or too arrogant to be appropriately afraid. "You Valenti." Marco's voice was loud, aggressive, playing to his audience. "I know my wife and kid are in there. I've got rights. Courts will back me up. So why don't you save us all some trouble and send them out?" Dominic didn't respond immediately. He studied Marco the way he'd study a particularly unpleasant insect. Cataloging, measuring, deciding exactly how much pressure it would take to crush him. "Your wife." Dominic's voice was quiet, conversational, the dangerous kind of quiet. "You mean the woman you've been terrorizing for years?" Marco's smile faltered. "That's family business. You don't know. The woman whose wrist you bruised last week." Dominic continued as if Marco hadn't spoken. "The one you stalked to a shelter. The one you've been hunting like prey." Marco's friends exchanged nervous glances. They were starting to realize this wasn't going the way they'd expected. "And your daughter?" Dominic took a step closer to the gate. "The child whose leg you broke when she was 4 years old. The little girl you pushed down the stairs. That daughter?" Marco's face went red. She fell. Kids fall. That's not... I've had men research you, Marco Delgado. Dominic's voice dropped lower, forcing Marco to lean in to hear. Every arrest, every restraining order, every charge that mysteriously got dropped. I know exactly who you are. Marco tried to rally his bravado. Yeah? And who am I? You're a coward who beats women and children because they can't fight back. You're a predator who uses fear to control people who should be able to trust you. You're everything wrong with men who think strength means cruelty. Dominic's hand shot through the gate bars, grabbing Marco's collar before anyone could react. He pulled the man close, their faces inches apart. And you're standing at my gate, threatening people under my protection. Do you understand how badly you've miscalculated? Marco's eyes went wide. His friends took a step back. The swagger was gone now, replaced by the dawning realization that he was in far deeper than he'd imagined. I've got connections, Marco stammered. Do you? Dominic smiled, and there was no warmth in it. Do you know Detective Morrison with the Chicago PD? He owes me 3 favors. Do you know Judge Antonelli? We play poker every month. The district attorney? She's my cousin. Marco's face went gray. Here's what's going to happen. Dominic released Marco's collar, letting him stumble backward. You're going to leave. You're going to leave this city. You're going to leave this state. And you're never going to contact Rosa or Sophia again. You can't just... If I hear your name within 100 miles of this city, Dominic continued, if you so much as send a postcard, I will make it my personal mission to show you what real power looks like. Not the kind you use against women and children. The kind that can make a man disappear so completely that no one ever remembers he existed. Marco's friends were already backing toward their car. They wanted no part of whatever was about to happen. They were smarter than their friend. Marco stood alone, trembling with rage and fear. Do you know what you're doing? You're interfering with a man's family, his property. That word, property, snapped something in Dominic. He moved faster than a man his age should, grabbing Marco by the throat and pressing him against the iron bars of the gate. They are not your property. His voice was barely a whisper, but it carried more menace than any shout. They are human beings. A woman who deserves to live without fear. A child who deserves to sleep in a bed instead of behind a dumpster. And if you ever call them your property again, they won't find enough pieces of you to identify. He released Marco with a shove that sent the man sprawling onto the pavement. 60 seconds. Dominic straightened his jacket. After that, my hospitality ends. Marco scrambled to his feet and ran. Actually ran. A man who had spent years making others afraid was now afraid himself. His car peeled out of the driveway, tires screaming against asphalt. Dominic watched until the taillights disappeared. Then he turned and walked back toward the mansion. His men parted for him like the sea. But something was different in the way they looked at him now. Not just fear, not just respect. Something that looked almost like admiration. Rosa and Sophia were in the kitchen when he returned. Sophia was eating pancakes that Maria had made, carefully cutting each piece into small bites the way children do when they're trying to savor something precious. Rosa stood when Dominic entered. Her eyes were red from crying, but her face held a question she was afraid to ask. He's gone. Dominic's voice was matter-of-fact. He won't be coming back. Rosa's knees buckled. She caught herself on the counter, overwhelmed by relief so profound it looked like pain. Sophia looked up from her pancakes. Mr. Dominic? Yes, sweetheart? Is the bad man going to come back? Every guard in the room stiffened. They'd seen what their boss had done at the gate. They knew exactly how thoroughly the bad man had been dealt with. Dominic crouched down beside Sophia's chair, putting himself at her level. No. The bad man is never going to bother you or your mama again. Promise? The word carried weight, more weight than Sophia could possibly understand. Dominic Valenti didn't make promises lightly. His word was his bond, and everyone in his organization knew it. I promise, and I always keep my promises. Sophia's face transformed. The fear that had lived behind her eyes for as long as she could remember began to fade. She looked at this man, this stranger who had found her in the dark and brought her into the light. And she did something that no one in that kitchen expected. She hugged him, her small arms wrapped around his neck, her face pressed into his shoulder. Her small body, so thin and fragile, trembled against his chest. "Thank you for being nice to my mama," she whispered. "Nobody is ever nice to my mama." Dominic's arms came up slowly, carefully. Hands that had signed death warrants now held a child with impossible gentleness. Something cracked open in his chest. The door that had been locked for 15 years finally swung free. "You're safe now," he said, his voice rough with emotion he couldn't quite hide. "Both of you. You're safe." 6 months later, the Valenti mansion sounded different. There was laughter in the hallways, small footsteps running across marble floors, the smell of chocolate chip cookies baking in the kitchen. Sofia Martinez was healthy, thriving in school, and had friends who came over for playdates. Her limp was barely noticeable now, thanks to physical therapy that had been quietly arranged and paid for. She called the mansion home without hesitation. The photograph she'd clutched that first night was now framed on her bedroom wall. New photos had joined it. Birthday parties, Christmas morning, Dominic teaching her to play chess in his study. Rosa managed the household staff with quiet efficiency. She'd gained weight, healthy weight. The gaunt exhaustion was gone. She smiled now, laughed at Maria's jokes, existed in the world instead of hiding from it. The divorce was finalized, full custody granted. Marco Delgado was last seen leaving the state, though some said he'd been strongly encouraged to find new horizons. Rosa didn't ask questions about that. Some things didn't need answers. As for Dominic, the transformation was visible to everyone who knew him. The locked nursery door was open now. He'd cleared it out himself, donated everything to a children's charity. In its place was Sophia's art studio. She liked to paint, and he'd spent a small fortune on supplies she didn't need, but loved anyway. His men still feared him. That hadn't changed. He was still ruthless when business required it. Enemies still learned hard lessons about crossing the Valenti family. But they also saw him at Sophia's school recitals, at parent-teacher conferences, helping with homework at the kitchen table while his lieutenants waited impatiently for meetings that started late because a 7-year-old needed help with long division. They whispered that Dominic Valenti had gone soft. They were wrong. He'd just finally found something hard enough to protect. The adoption papers had come through last month. Sofia Martinez was now Sofia Valenti, legally and permanently. When he'd signed them, his hand had been steadier than it had ever been. One evening, Dominic sat in his study reviewing paperwork that suddenly seemed less important than it used to. Territory disputes, collection schedules, profit margins. The things that had consumed his every waking moment for 30 years now felt like background noise. The door burst open, and Sophia ran in, clutching a piece of paper against her chest. "I made this for you." She thrust the drawing at him with the pride that only children possess. Dominic took it carefully, studying the crayon artwork with the same attention he'd give a crucial business document. Two figures stood side by side, a tall man in a dark suit, a small girl in a yellow dress. Both were smiling. At the top, in careful 7-year-old handwriting, she'd written 2 words, "My family." Dominic stared at the paper. His throat tightened. His eyes burned with something he hadn't felt in 15 years. "This is beautiful, Principessa." His voice was rough. "The most beautiful thing anyone has ever given me." Sophia beamed and bounced out of the room, already calling for her mother to come see. Dominic carefully pinned the drawing above his desk, right next to the photograph of Catherine that had hung there alone for 15 years. 2 pictures now, 2 families, one lost, one found. Sometimes the most broken things become the most beautiful, and sometimes the most dangerous man in the city is just a father waiting to find his daughter. Thanks for watching. If this story reminded you that family isn't about blood, but about choice, let me know in the comments. And subscribe for more stories that prove even the hardest hearts can learn to love again.